Hello everyone, and welcome to Volume 2 of the Lionel 2021 catalog. Now I know this is a bit of an impromptu video, but as always with Lionel catalogs, I usually get an email that they're up, and then I put everything else on hold and review the catalog at the next possible moment. So, since this is a Volume 2 catalog, Volume 2 catalogs are generally shorter than Volume 1, but they still have a good amount of new entries or new locomotives, rail cars, or anything of the sort that makes it worthwhile. And we'll probably see some repeated starter sets towards the middle or the end of the catalog as well, since it is a Volume 2, with a few slight adjustments if necessary. But anyways, let's get on to the catalog. So starting off, it looks like we have the same Lionel sign to the top right, or at least being from the driver's view of what looks like the interior of the Acela. So Amtrak is continuing this theme with the original Acela, with a few, I think that's a rulebook down there too. So there's a little bit of realism being put into play with the interior of this cab, so let's get to the first few pages. Table of contents. Line Chief can now be operated on a phone. Now we have O-scale, and right off the bat we have Strasbourg 90. So, I saw a video about this earlier today, and I, along with a bunch of other O-scale modelers, are absolutely overjoyed to see Strasbourg 90 finally have an O-gauge, or rather an O-scale model of this great locomotive. And I believe, well, that's not the right page yet. We have Legacy Steam, showing you the insides of a Legacy Steam locomotive for O-scale. There's Bluetooth and a few other features it has. Here's the 210 page. So, it looks like we have a few different variations of Strasbourg. But more interestingly, we have Great Western 2000s and Seaboard Airline 525. That's a very interesting livery for the basis of 90. And even more so with the Osage Railway. I'm not sure what this one is, but I would say I like this one out of the, out of the 7 shown here. But counting the Great Westerns and the 90s, or at least the actual Strasbourg 90s, I would have to go with this one down here. With the original Strasbourg logo, some of the lining on the tender, and we have some of the white outlining on the wheels. Although I'll have to research Osage Railway, but these are all very good models of the 210. And of course, what is Strasbourg 90 without its coaches? So we have some open-end Strasbourg O-scale coaches. I believe, other than Canadian National 89, I think this is the first time Lionel did any O-scale Strasbourg, I believe. And even then, I think Strasbourg 89 came out in something like 2013 or 12, if I remember correctly. So it's definitely great to see that they're bringing a well-known tourist railroad into O-scale. This observation car I'm not really too familiar with, although it does look pretty interesting with a lighter shade of brown and yellow when compared to the R coaches. And Philadelphia and Reading I've seen before. It's been used on a few excursion trains, but I think this one, what's the name of that? I think the Paradise has been used during the 80s from the looks of it, so that's definitely cool. Next we have very interesting 280s. We have Santa Fe, Buffalo Creek, and Gully. One I haven't heard of it too, I can't see that far back. 3, we have Maine Central, in what looks like one of the last liveries to be worn by a steam locomotive for the MC. But I don't know when that livery was applied for steam locomotives. Probably sometime in the late 40s, but very interesting to see that on a 280. Next we have Chesapeake and Ohio, New York Central, and Western Pacific. Again, with O-scale, great detail along the boilers. And some of these also have white rims, I believe, so that's pretty good. Just getting a closer look at some of these. I don't know where the logo was for Western Pacific, though. I don't know if it was in the center of the coal or the center of the tender itself, but knowing Lionel, they've probably done a good job at making it as close to reality as possible, or as much as that or as close to accuracy as possible. So here's one last look at the 280s, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but if you want to see the description that's up here, I can't really zoom in on it all the time, so also excuse my voice cracking at some points, but if you want to read the description for these locomotives and anything else in the catalog, feel free to pause the video and look at the description, which I believe should be visible from the screen recorder that I'm using. Anyways, now we have some cab forwards again. I don't know when the last time these cab forwards were released by Lionel, but I remember seeing them a few years ago. It's the last time exactly when, I'm not too sure, but it's definitely great to see these released again. So right off the bat, we have a daylight cab forward, kind of continuing the tradition of what was released about in 2016 or 17, followed by a standard cab forward, number 4294, and then we have a Lark livery for the cab forward, as well as a gray boiler and a red roof. And we also have an unmarked one over here, and another standard cab forward, 4281. So I believe, since Lark and the gray boiler are relatively new in the cab forward series, I believe this is Lionel continuing with their Southern Pacific theme as well. Since about 2 years ago, they released a fantasy Lark and Golden State livery for the Golden State locomotives for Southern Pacific. So I believe they could be bringing this over to some of their other locomotives for the Southern Pacific as well. And I actually like some of these, especially the gray boiler. I'm not sure if this one actually existed on one of the earlier models of a cab forward, maybe an AC1 or an AC3, if those are the right classifications for the cab forwards, but considering the way most steam locomotives were built back in the day in the early 1900s, I can definitely see this kind of livery on a much older cab forward, or at least one of the first cab forwards on the Southern Pacific. Not so much for an AC12 though, but they're still good nonetheless. And similarly, I believe that the streamlined liveries such as the Daylight and the Lark look better on the AC12, and the black and the gray ones look better on some of the older models, but that's just my opinion when comparing Southern Pacific cab forwards. Similarly, we have the Union Pacific 412-2s. Also just as large, and we also have another fantasy scheme, this time continuing the Union Pacific theme that they had a few years ago. This time we have the Union Pacific 9014 in a Greyhound livery. So that's cool to note. I'm also interested in 9002. It doesn't have any markings for the Union Pacific, but it just has the number. Oh wait, never mind, there's Union Pacific on the cab. I'll have to look into that one and see if that was an official livery, possibly as a prototype, considering the low number range. But with O-Scale, it's very good to see Lionel recognizing many of these prototypes or proposed liveries, such as the Conrail Reading T1 from a few years ago, which was covered in my American Railroad Iceberg. Now we have some more 412-2s, and it seems like this is another, what I like to call, designated fantasy locomotive for a catalog, in which they use the same model and put a bunch of different liveries on it. And some of these actually work pretty well. For example, C&O fits right in with the steam heritage that they have. I'm not sure what these are called on the front, but most of the Chetsey steam locomotives had pistons. I think they're called that on the front, but I don't know that much steam locomotive terminology, but the whole feel of a 412-2 for the Chesapeake and Ohio feels right. Maybe not the wheel arrangement, but everything else about it kind of describes some of the steam locomotives that they had. Milwaukee Road, I can say the tender maybe, but the boiler, I'm not really sure if it fits the mold of most other Milwaukee Road steam locomotives within a certain time period, so that's kind of on the lower end of my ranking for these. But Denver and Rio Grande, this actually looks pretty good. It's a good combination of silver, the signature green, and black that they've had for a lot of locomotives. And the same thing can be said with Northern Pacific, with, I think that's a slightly different shade of green, I'm not too sure. But there's also the signature red cab, which can be found on some Northern Pacific. Oh, wait. Apparently this is for Southern Pacific. It was the red cab that threw me off. Before you say I don't know my steam railroads, it was a red cab. I know a few Northern Pacific locomotives do have a red cab, and sometimes some green. But then again, so does Great Northern. But you know what? Now that I mention it, I'm surprised they didn't do a Great Northern model for the 412 too, if they were going to choose that for a fantasy scheme. They already have the Rio Grande, SB&S, and Southern Pacific apparently, but I could definitely see Great Northern pulling off this livery, or at least this kind of locomotive pulling off the Great Northern livery, since the from the steam locomotive is almost the same as some of the freight locomotives that they had on Great Northern, and so is the livery in a way. Now, in terms of this being Southern Pacific, I'm not really sure if SB had this color. Maybe it was for the Northern Pacific, but that's for more research to decide. And SB&S looks pretty good too. I think it's a certain shading of black and silver that makes it fit well. It kind of reminds me of SB&S 700 with the same gray on the smoke box and then black for the rest of the locomotive. And that gold outlining for the logo looks pretty good too. So I can definitely see Lionel using 700 as a basis for this livery. But overall, great models. For realism, I would have to give the award for, well, realism for fantasy liveries. I would have to say C&L would be the most believable for this kind of locomotive on that terrain. And best looking would definitely be Rio Grande. Now we have the Legacy Diesels. Here's the inside of what I believe is an SD40. Anyways, that's showing the components of the locomotive. And starting off, we have the SD70 Max. We have BNSF in the H3 livery, as well as Conrail with a white roof. BNSF, we have the BN patch, I believe. I don't know if there's a name. I think these are still known as executives, but just with a BNSF patch. I'm not sure if there's a nickname for Burlington Northern Executive Max, but have BNSF patches on them. I think they're still called executives, but anyways, I think there's something off with the cab for the cab of these locomotives. I don't know if the shade of white matches with the rest of the light brown or cream that's on the rest of the locomotive. But other than that, the rest of it looks good. And then we also have Norfolk Southern 1800, which is rebuilt from an SD60, I think. No, they were rebuilt from SD70s, but anyways. We also have CSX down here, as well as this experimental BNSF 9617. Basically, it was an executive fake bonnet, to say the least. A combination between the executive livery and the Santa Fe livery. I'll let you decide what you think about this locomotive down here, but I think it's pretty interesting, but the executive is a little more pleasing to the eyes, I think. Although that red outlining is pretty interesting. And most surprisingly, we have Paducah and Louisville with their SD70 Mac making the cut for Lionel O-scale locomotives. That's another great thing that Lionel has been doing recently. Other than fantasy schemes, they've also been taking real-life locomotives such as SD70 Max, SD40s, GP38s, and they're making O-scale models of locomotives that exist on real short lines. So that's definitely great for local rail fans in the area who may be wanting to purchase something like that. And it's great to see Lionel expand their horizons for the range of these locomotives. Next we have the SD45 with Burlington Northern, a high-hood Norfolk Southern SD45, as well as a high-hood Springfield Terminal. Then we have Milwaukee, Pennsylvania, and an EMD demonstrator. Also, one more thing I wanted to point out. The Conrail Mac is actually CSX with number 777 with the blue and yellow patch. But anyways, we have the SD45s over here. And for some reason, they have the long hood facing forward in these promotional pictures for the SD45. probably to represent how they're supposed to operate, I believe, since Norfolk Southern, they definitely used these locomotives for long hood forward operation, especially in the southern regions of their territory back in the 80s and 90s. So maybe when these versions of the SD45s are purchased, maybe the forward operation is supposed to be long hood forward. And if I'm correct, then that's something nice to know. Next, we have the DD35. Just like the gas turbines in Volume 1, we have a lot of Union Pacific fantasy schemes. Well, not counting the Greyhound livery. At least not yet. But other than that, we also have Alaska and Santa Fe for the DD35s. So, Alaska, I'm not really sure about seeing this one in person, since I think there's too much space between the Alaska, the circle logo over here, and then the words Alaska between the second engine. So that's not really Lionel's fault. That's more of a design error or a design flaw if you were to adapt an Alaska livery in that scheme. And then we have Santa Fe, which I think it has the same problem, but I'm a little bit more forgiving towards the Santa Fe because, one, it's one of my favorite fallen flags, and two, the design looks more natural on Santa Fe. I remember I think they might have purchased a few large locomotives back in the 60s and 70s, and considering that Union Pacific usually operated these over long distances, over vast deserts, I could definitely see the Santa Fe going over similar territory at times, or at least similar terrain, operating something like this. And then we have the modern day livery of the DD35. Basically the front with the gray on top, followed by the American flag. Now, if there's anyone out there who wants to rebuild a DD35 for Union Pacific, I suggest doing it in this scheme so this way it could go right in service on UP. But that's just my opinion on the matter. But overall, these are some pretty good models, and it's nice to see Lionel following the same trends that they've been doing for the past year or two, first with Southern Pacific, now with Union Pacific, and basically making O-scale models of all of the different locomotives in those railroads. Now, on the total opposite size, I was correct the first time, but anyways, we have the SW1200s. We have Rio Grande, EJ&E, Penn Central, BNSF, Santa Fe, and US Steel. So these are some pretty nice liveries. This one in particular, Strasburg recently acquired an SW1200, and this is one of the proposed liveries, but instead of Santa Fe, it would say Strasburg. I'm not sure which one was declared the winner at the moment, but the rest of these look pretty good, and the EJ&E, that's technically a darker shade of orange than what they usually have, but it still has that industrial feel to it. So that's pretty good. Same thing goes for Penn Central. I think the shades are correct here. It's just the industrial look with these small switchers that you can see in general. Although I'm not too sure about BNSF if they roster an SW1200. And I'm not really sure about the H2 scheme, but anyways. Now we have the Sea-Liners in what looks like a Fairbanks Morse demonstrator. I never knew that FM had the, I want to say that's a Northern Pacific inspired livery for FM. Although I don't know if Northern Pacific themselves rostered any Fairbanks Morse locomotives, but it's definitely a different thing to see on a Sea-Liner, as well as the original Pennsylvania livery for the Sea-Liners. I know they had Erie builds back in the day, but they were usually Brunswick green instead of brown. But it's very interesting to see that. Next we have Canadian National and New York Central, both of which are based on the Erie builds. And of course, as a Long Island Rail fan, I am very glad to see this one. Long Island 2001. One of three, I believe. One of two or three liveries that the Sea-Liners had on Long Island. And with two dashing Dan logos on the side. So that's a nice touch that they have. And more surprisingly, we have MTA officially licensed Osgood Bradley LIRR World's Fair coaches. I believe this was a relatively rare livery to see the Osgood Bradleys in. The Oscar Bradley coaches were originally from Bangor and Rootstock, and I'm not sure if they arrived on the LARR until the 1960s or 70s, but I think photos of these cars in particular in the gray and orange instead of the blue and white is relatively rare. I know there's a certain Osgood Bradley coach at the Riverhead Railroad Museum which is being restored right now, but that's being repainted into its original Bangor and Rootstock red from the blue and white after being used as a Sandike car. So, great job on the LWR for recognizing relatively unseen or rare aspects in railroading history. Next, we have a New Haven Sea Liner in the traditional black and gold New Haven paint, as well as a bunch of New Haven Pullmans. I'm not sure if these locomotives pulled these coaches. They probably did. It's just, I'm not really sure if the liveries matched up for the time periods at least, but still, the detail is there. The detail is great for the locomotive and the coaches. Although for some reason, these coaches have 4 axles while the other ones have 6. So that's something interesting to note. Next, we have a BNSF coal train set with SD70 Mac 9526 leading a line of 6 BNSF hoppers. Pretty good with the realism, and based on all these hoppers, I could see something like this being used for a route out in the Midwest. Particularly, I don't know the name of the line, but it was a former Burlington Northern line that went to the middle of Wyoming. That was one of the heaviest coal lines in the Midwest for Burlington Northern and BNSF. So if you're trying to recreate something like that, I definitely recommend using something like this, where it's a bunch of coal cars lined up behind each other. Next, we have a Burlington Northern Hustle Muscle freight set. Very interesting to see a BNSD45 leading a few freight cars over here in what looks to be like an unofficial Burlington Northern Heritage train. We have a Northern Pacific flatbed with a fire truck on top, a Burlington Roots hopper car, I believe, a Frisco boxcar, and then an SPNS caboose, which includes a camera on the top. So a great way to put together Burlington Northern's heritage for this kind of train set. Now we have a Cambria and Indiana Bicentennial coal train set. Now this is very interesting. Never have I seen a bicentennial freight set done by either a model railroad company or by any other railroad for that matter. Usually they have a bicentennial locomotive and maybe a few passenger cars, but I've never heard of bicentennial freight cars before, and especially not for a railroad this small, using an SW1200. So, great detail with the hoppers. We'll just zoom in on some of these to get a greater appreciation of the hoppers that are shown here. There's a present-day American flag and a caboose. Another thing to point out is the alignment of stripes on the front or on the grille of number 36. This whole design is very good for a freight switcher. And sometimes I think it might be a little bit more impressive than some of the R bicentennial locomotives used by Class 1s, so great job. Now we have Grand Canyon with number 29 being the main locomotive to pull these coach cars. Now, are these Osgood Bradleys? I think they're Osgood Bradley models. Now, I'm not really sure if... I'll have to get back to that one, but I don't know what the original heritage is for the Grand Canyon coaches offhand. I think they're either Burlington or Santa Fe, but probably Burlington or maybe not, but these coaches look very similar to the Osgood Bradley ones, and even 29 looks pretty similar to some of the 280s that we saw earlier. So this could be an example of where they're using the same model basis again. I think with number 29, it's because there's too much room between the top of the cab and the top of the boiler. So that could show the original 280 model that they were using for some of the other locomotives earlier. But it's not too noticeable. It still works. It still looks great, and of course all the attention to detail is there with the locomotive and the coaches, even though these just seem to be renderings for now and will likely use the Osgood Bradley model, but it's still a good set. I'm not sure how much Grand Canyon stock Lionel has made in the past, so this is definitely nice to see in a Lionel catalog, especially in O-scale. Now we have some wooden coaches by Pennsylvania and Boston and Maine, using the same model as the Strasbourg coaches, but that's still good. Now we have some boxcars, Ann Arbor, Canadian National, Ford, with 3 different railroads on here, Norfolk and Western, Penn Central, and Western Pacific. Then we have some present-day high-Q boxcars, CN, Conrail, NS, and I can't really tell what this one is, but all of which with graffiti. Then we have an Erie and Rock Island boxcar with hobos on the inside. We have some hoppers. Interesting to see Norfolk Southern, the original Norfolk Southern listed here. Alaska, Erie, Lackawanna. Not really sure if these covered hoppers were around at the time, as most of these are fallen flags, but it's still good to put a fallen flag on the hopper, I guess. Now we have some flat cars, and some couple cam cabooses. Now we have some regular cabooses, standard dome modern boxcars, some more hoppers from CSX. Now we have O-Gauge. And right at the front, we have Amtrak 46, the 50th anniversary heritage unit. And I believe this is the first time Lionel has ever made a Genesis. I think I remember hearing somewhere on an O-Gauge forum a few years ago that Lionel never made an Amtrak Genesis. So, yet another first for Amtrak with an entirely new model. Of course, it's O-Gauge and it's not 1000% accurate. I think the nose for the locomotive is certain angle too high up, I think. The tilt for the nose isn't really as accurate for the real deal, but I think that's because it's O-Gauge and you're trying to fit into a smaller component, and I think that engine may be extending all the way to both trucks, and that probably leaves you with less room to work on the front while trying to be as accurate as possible, but it's still great to see that we have a Genesis here. Now we have some more options for Lion Chief. Lion Chief Plus 2.0. And here we go. We're starting off with Hudson's on the left and Genesis on the right. For the Hudson's, we have the classic New York Central, as well as Union Pacific, Santa Fe, and Lionel lines. I'm kind of surprised to see Lionel lines on this newer rendition of a Lion Chief Hudson, as I'm going to call it. I don't think they have Lionel Lion Chief Hudson before this point, so it's definitely interesting to see a classic Lionel model being readapted into an O-Gauge set, or at least an O-Gauge locomotive, rather than no scale. Next we have the Genesis with numbers 150 in Phase 5, 111 in Phase 4, and number 40 in Phase 3, along with number 46. So these look pretty good as well. And I think with 111, I can see how they use the Phase 4 heritage unit as a basis for this, since the shade of gray on the front, it's technically not the exact same as the rest of the locomotive, but it's closer to the 40th anniversary heritage unit of this. So I guess that's kind of forgivable, since the Phase 3 looks just as good with everything else being correct with the paint schemes, but I'm not going to complain too much about a certain shade being just a little bit too off from the real deal, or a certain line not being long enough like this Phase 3, but that's besides the point. Next we have an Army freight set with a new RS3 and a custom livery. Next we have the Pennsylvania Keystone set, another Lionel O-Gauge classic. I believe I've been seeing this in almost every O-Gauge catalog for the past 10 years or so, but still a good starter set. A good way to get started. Now we have some customized boxcars. Let's look at some of the ones over here. Great Locomotive Chase of 1862. Union Pacific, 1862 to 2022. And Smithsonian, 1846 to 2021. Your view personalized on the right. Expand your world. Some more accessories. Plug and plays. I think we're getting closer to the end. Up, and we have American Flyer. Starting off with a Burlington Northern GP7. Very interesting livery to have that locomotive in. Now we have the 75th anniversary of American Flyer. And the first two sets we have is a Texas and Pacific Deluxe freight set, followed by a Clinchfield coal hauler set. Very interesting livery set they have on the GP7s. And I must say, great job for attention to detail with these smaller freight cars that they have for American Flyer. Next we have other GP7s, including BN. Again, I don't really think Burlington Northern had this livery for the GP7s, or if they did, it was probably a different shade of black, or maybe they had something in between. Next we have Chessie System, as well as Lehigh Valley and Wabash. And after that, we have a few freight cars, box cars, tank cars, log dump cars, assorted rolling stock, T-Rex oil. And then we have HO scale, or shall I say, HO gauge, in which they use the same Polar Express model over and over again. But HO gauge is just starting out, so it's understandable. And I guess that was the only thing they had to offer in this catalog. Although I must say that Texas Special SW, I think that's an SW1 or an SW6, or it's definitely an interesting model to see the Texas Special livery put on such a small locomotive, as well as a boxcar over there. We have some more stuff over here. And that is the end of the Volume 2 catalog. Overall, we have some pretty interesting models for the second volume for 2021. And not surprisingly, it's more of a way to showcase most of the O-scale locomotives. You're not going to find much new O-gauge in Volume 2 of the catalog. With the exception of the Genesis. This is an entirely new model that they have for Lionel in general, and I'm surprised this wasn't released in Volume 1. But that probably goes to show that you shouldn't underestimate the O-gauge section in Volume 2, and that they still have something new. Even if it's not as much new material as Volume 1, it's still something. And in this case, it's very good. But in a way, it's more of a way to have O-scale models get the spotlight, or new O-scale ideas to be put into a catalog that are developed a little bit later on. As always, great job with the Long Island Sea Liner and the Osgood Bradley coaches. And out of all of these here, I'm going to say, surprisingly, not Strasburg 90 as my favorite. Although it's up there, it's not my favorite locomotive in this new catalog. Just doing one last look over, and I can determine my favorite of the catalog to be almost there. It wouldn't really be fair to do one overall, so I'll do one for steam and I'll do one for diesel. For steam, I'm going to go with the Rio Grande 412-2. And for diesel, I'm going to go with the Bicentennial SW1200. They did a great job with attention to detail, especially with all of the covers leading to the engine, the stars around the 36, and especially with the grille over here, representing the stars and stripes of the American flag. And it almost reminds me of another Long Island Bicentennial unit that was made a few years ago, specifically number 105. But Lionel just did an outstanding job with this set and with this locomotive, so I'm going to choose this one for my favorite for the diesel. But anyways, other than that, thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.